to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics who write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs, and currently I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Today's guest is Kate Lowry, author of the book Unbreakable: How to Thrive Under Fear-Based Leaders. That's what drove me to wanting to interview you, because we've all come across fear-based leaders. I'm not a fan of it, but I was interested in reading your book and talking about it. So, Kate, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. So, Kate, before we lead into the book, why don't you give us your professional history? How did you get to where you're at now?
Yeah, definitely. So I founded my first company actually when I was in high school and then continued to work with startups while I was in college. But I wanted to have a harder skill set to offer them. So I joined McKinsey, which was kind of like a amazing business boot camp. And it was at McKinsey that I noticed how lonely executives are and how they really need people to help them make decisions. I ended up moving back into the startup world, working at an AI startup called and it was there that I learned kind of how CEOs have really strong influence on the culture of different companies. I spent some time at Meta working on product strategy, helping them decide what to build, buy, or kill. And that's where I learned to think about everything, including myself, as a product to be iterated. And then after that, I spent some time in venture, directly advising startup CEOs. And it was in that time that I started to notice the rise of fear based leaders.
Well, I think you've already had an interesting ride, and working at McKinsey, that's always a great thing to do for anybody's resume. What was the entrepreneurial venture you were in high school?
I founded an international French horn trading company. So I was trained as a conservatory musician starting at a pretty young age, and created a company where I was selling French horns all over the world to different types of orchestra musicians, different types of conservatory students. And that really taught me the ropes of marketing, sales, procurement, all of that stuff.
I have to say, Kate, that is the first time, and I've dealt with thousands of entrepreneurs since the 80s. I've never met anybody who started their entrepreneurial career selling French horns. That
Yeah, I
that's
know.
a,
You kind of
that's
have
a
to take the expertise that you have. And at the time, my biggest expertise was in orchestral performance. And so that's how I paid for my entire college.
Well, let's jump into your book. You begin the book with resilience rather than with difficult bosses. Why did you decide that strengthening ourselves had to come before learning how to deal with fear-based leaders? And maybe you can also define fear-based leaders.
Yes, absolutely. So when we think about fear based leaders, you think of top down, hierarchical, my way or the highway, high control, very brittle leadership styles. In parenting, this might be called like authoritarian parenting. In business, sometimes people call this like just having a really toxic boss. And the reason I started with how to build resilience in my book is because these types of leaders really grind people down. And if they're super burnt out, they don't actually have the resources to use any of the strategies in my book. So they have to build themselves up and cultivate some resilience before they'll be able to actually try and apply some of the things that work against fear based leaders to retain agency and autonomy.
Did you early on face a leader that managed by fear?
Yes, definitely. Actually, that started in my family. So my family was very like fear-based, hierarchical, top-down, and rigid. And then in my first, career, really at McKinsey, McKinsey is very interesting because you're dropped into different companies approximately every 2 to 3 months, and in each of them you have a brand new manager, a brand new team. And the reality is that a certain percentage of them, maybe 20%, are going to be not as great people. And so I had ex-military bosses at McKinsey that weren't so great. I had other people who were I call them like promotion climbers who would step on everyone else. But then this is something that I started to witness more and more as I pushed into the startup and VC space. And, early in my career, I maybe saw something like 2 in 10, 3 in 10 leaders like this. And in the last 5 years, it's been much more like 5 to 7 in 10, which is deeply concerning. And that's why I wrote the book.
Very interesting. You describe, uh, identify almost like a stool. The more sources of identity we have, the harder it is for someone to knock us down. Why are people who derive most of their identity from their careers particularly vulnerable to fear-based leaders?
Yes, this is really important. So, a lot of people feel like, their sources of identity, like being a baker or a gardener or a mom, detract from their power in the workplace. And I'm here to tell you that's completely not true. Each source of identity that you have, whether that's being a father or a community group leader, adds another leg to the stool or chair that you're sitting on that supports you. But if your only source of identity is that you're the VP of marketing at XYZ company, well, when someone comes along and cuts you down, saying, you're terrible at this, I don't like you, you're bad at your job, off with your head, you essentially fall over. And so it's really important to cultivate those different aspects of identity to support you along your career journey.
Do you think women are better at dealing with that because they don't always see primarily they don't look at themselves primarily as their job like men do?
I think it depends on the person. I do think that women are pushed to multitask more and straddle more different types of roles. If you asked a lot of women what's more important to them, their role as a parent or their job, a lot of them would
Yeah,
probably say their role as a parent. And that,
yeah.
that can definitely make them more resilient in a lot of ways. I also think that, women are used to having a little bit less privilege in the workplace. And so they take more heat earlier on, which can get them a little bit more used to it. But that's not always a good thing.
Has your research found is there one gender over the other that's more of a fear-based leadership?
I have seen it both ways many times. I would say that because there are more men in leadership roles in general in business, more fear based leaders tend to be men. However, with women, it's a little bit more stealthy. Sometimes you'll see classic mean girl tactics in the workplace, clicks, shutting people down, passive aggressive comments as opposed to overt aggression. Men have more permission to be overtly aggressive in the workplace.
Because they're men.
Yes.
Because it's like an expectation, boys will be boys kind of thing.
Yeah, like if you have a male boss who screams at direct reports, sometimes people will see that as like, wow, he's so powerful. He's claiming what's his own, he's putting everyone on their place. If a female boss screams at direct reports, they get characterized pretty differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it generational or it doesn't matter? Like are
There,
most of these fear-based bosses, because like Bobby Knight was a famous basketball coach. I don't know if you remember him, but
Mhm.
he was fear-based. Uh, and so, but eventually, players didn't want to play for somebody like that. And probably most people don't want to work for somebody like that now with the internet. You have all kinds of options that you don't have to put up with that. So, are there less people managing by fear because the market for really good employees uh, is always thriving, even in even in downturns economically?
Yeah, so right now it's much more an employer's market than employees. We're seeing
Right.
pullbacks in different types of benefits. And what I've noticed, at least in the tech space, is that about 40% of the people are no longer hiding bad behavior tendencies, and another 30 to 40% are feeling like they need to have high control bad behavior in order to fit in. And so while this style, was originally more popular say in the 1960s, it's come full swing back. And we're starting to see this in younger leaders, particularly in the startup space, where people will say, we need to do 996, like, let's do founder mode. Like, like if you're not fully dedicating your whole life to my startup, you don't belong here. And so, while that has terrible results long term for attrition and also negatively impacts people's innovation capacity, the short term make everyone jump, make everyone move sometimes hides the fact that it's actually kind of killing their companies.
Interesting. You identify relationships, values, abilities, our physical self, social background, and where we come from as sources of identity. Which of those has been most important in making you personally unbreakable?
I think that where we come from is probably the most important, at least to me. I grew up in environments that said, like, you need to grow up and become a good wife, a Catholic mom, someone who goes to college, gets married, has four kids by the time you're 30. And I chose a really different path from that and kind of said, no, I reject the hierarchical system that I was born into and chose to find something dramatically more interesting. And the fact is that when you grow up in environments that have really high amounts of pressure, punitive correction, etc., it gives you a lot of reps at practicing resilience. And so while some people get crushed by that, I said, not for me. I'm not going to let these folks get me down. Like, let's get up, get out, and find a different place in the world.
How can someone determine whether their identity has become too dependent on their job, title, company, or boss?
Well, I would say all they have to do is imagine being laid off tomorrow. If they would be fundamentally crushed and feel like it was a reflection of their own worth to be included in a layoff, they're probably too attached to their particular job. And a lot of people cling to titles, roles as signs of success because, a lot of millennials like me have been taught you have to climb every ladder, get every gold star, add to your resume. And I want people to know that their worth is inherent. They have worth just by existing and by being here. And that what their title is does not determine their value on the planet.
That's hard to convince people when they're so ambitious, and especially if they're depending on the culture. Because I'm in Asia, and our students and young people have an enormous amount of familial pressure to be successful, get the best grades, get the best job, make the most money, and if not, they're considered a failure. And so I think in that particular culture, it's not as bad in the United States or in the West as it is here in the East where I'm at right now. Why do you think there's that difference?
Yeah. So I used to live in Shanghai and Beijing. And what I would say is that these cultures have, a very strong sense of both filial piety and a stronger sense of communal responsibility. And so people's worth in Asia is often determined by how they contribute to the familial structures around them. And it's also highly status driven. There's a much stronger sense of keeping up with the Joneses. um, and part of that is because a lot of Asian cultures developed later than the Western countries did in terms of having industrial revolutions, etc. Which means that there hasn't been quite as much time for them to differentiate and develop the individualism that highly wealthy countries like the Nordic countries have. Similarly, in sociology, there's a concept called cultural tightness, and in cultures that have had more recent famines, major political shifts, etc., it shows that there is a higher level of punishment for deviation from social norms because it's actually more dangerous to how the society functions. In cultures that have had more stable long term success, there's more acceptance of differentiating from norms and individualism because people don't have to function as a cohesive unit to defeat famine or defeat plague.
What's the earliest warning sign that tells you I'm not dealing with a demanding leader, I'm dealing with a fear-based leader?
I think that it's the feeling you get when you're around them. So some people might say that I'm a demanding leader and that I have high expectations for my teams and the people that I work with because I see their potential and I want them to rise to meet it. However, if you're around someone and you feel your whole body recoil or cringe or a wave of fear shoot through you, that is not a feeling that belongs in the workplace. And so, if you find yourself dreading going to work on Monday and quaking in your boots when you're around these types of people, or starting to feel nauseous in meetings because you're being ragged on, you know that's when you're likely dealing with someone who's more fear based.
You argue that insecurity is really driving the train. What does an extremely powerful but deeply insecure leader actually fear?
They fear lack of relevance. They fear people seeing them for being as insecure and weak as they really are. And they fear not being loved, not being liked. A lot of them tend to say, well, I can't get people to love and like me, so I might as well get them to fear me, right? They're deeply afraid of being below or unequal to the people around them. They can't really conceive of the idea of equality. They either are stepping on someone else or being stepped on. So they never want to be the one who's losing the game, so to speak.
Do you think that stems from their own familial background? Like these fear leaders, did they grow up in a family where the patriarch or maybe the matriarch led by fear?
Yes. So in psychology, we would call this attachment theory. So the way that people relate to others around them in the world, unless they've done intensive therapy to change that, is based on how their parents related to them. And so if parents related to their children in a conditional way, I only love you if you get good grades. I only support you if you win this achievement. I will only like you if you are my confidant and take care of me all the time. It's that type of conditionality that then creates insecurity within leaders like this that they then carry into the workplace.
Yeah, I can imagine. How did your family lead? You said your family and you grew up with that. What's your father or mother's background professionally, or was it just, I think you mentioned you're Catholics?
Yeah, so my dad was ex military, and the home was run like a very tight ship. It was extremely high control, kind of like kids should only be seen, not heard.
Yeah.
When I say jump, you better jump type of culture. And my mom was quite different than that. She was almost more like a flower child of sorts. But she similarly had very high standards of what she expected me to do. And both of my parents saw me not as an individual, but as someone to serve them in certain ways. With my dad, I was expected to serve the household, serve his needs. And with my mom, I was really expected to take care of her at all times. And that type of conditionality and harshness, where the punitive conditions were really, really severe, meant that I effectively had, 20 years of being able to run experiments on fear based leaders and figure out what worked on them growing up. Because when your incentives are, do you get to see your friends or go to the doctor or do the things that you need to do, it basically encourages you to figure out what strategies actually work. And then I refine those in my workplaces, at McKinsey, at Meta, at Insight Partners, um, because I think that too many people see these types of leaders and feel like they're all powerful. And I would say to them, you are powerful. You have way more power than you think because these people are deeply fragile and they're deeply brittle.
How many kids were in your family?
Just me.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Oh my gosh. So that must
so
have been really hard. That sounds like a lot of therapy hours.
yeah, I essentially like became an expert in trauma therapy by asking different therapy specialists to train me in how these different types of environments work, and that's how I developed expertise in dark tetrad psychology, which fear-based leaders in psychology would be termed as dark tetrad, which means they have mixes of Machiavellianism, psychopathy, sadism, and narcissism. And each fear based leader is a little bit different, but those types of traits are part of what make people want to dominate at all costs.
Wow. Was your father career military?
He was in the Navy, and then he created his own companies. So he launched, I guess, what would be the precursor of something like Morning Brew, which is a business newsletter, and ran that for many years. So he was the CEO of his own small business. And then my mom primarily worked in like local telecom. Um, and so my dad really ran his own ship at home and at work. He had a sign on the door of his office that said, "No whiners."
Eh, That couldn't have been easy. You make an important distinction between shame and guilt. What does that distinction help us understand the behavior of fear-based leaders?
Yes, so shame is very different from guilt. Guilt says, I did something bad, and shame says, I am bad. So when you make a mistake or do something wrong, if you say I am a bad person because I made a mistake or did something wrong, that's shame. And shame can easily overwhelm an entire person. And so it's much more important to recognize that guilt is really critical and saying, "Oh, I did something wrong here. I should make up for that," which is very different.
Why do fear-based leaders so often confuse compliance with loyalty?
Well, fear based leaders aren't very interested in the emotions or needs of the people around them. And so, if they see people doing the things that they want, they assume it's because they've inspired loyalty rather than understanding that people are acting out of fear. This is partly because most fear based leaders surround themselves by sycophants. For example, when I worked at Meta, Mark Zuckerberg was completely surrounded by sycophants. Um, and those sycophants tell them, you are so good at your job. We love everything that you do. And the fear based leaders fail to recognize that this is a self preservation strategy. By adulating the fear based leader, they're trying to stay in good graces so that they aren't punished.
Is there people in public that we all could recognize as fear-based leaders?
Oh my
And
goodness.
are fear-based leaders more successful than people who treat people with respect?
They're definitely not more successful. If anything, they tend to fail upwards despite their fear based leadership rather than because of it. And there are so many examples in pop culture, out in the world. When you look at media and you see House of Cards, Game of Thrones, Billions, Succession, all of the leaders in all of those shows are fear based leaders. And right now, we have fear based leaders dominating in the tech sector. We have some fear based leaders dominating in politics. We have fear based leaders who are, dominating in other types of industry. and it's becoming, you know, relatively common for them to dominate in homes. And so what I would ask people to remember is, if everyone around you is afraid to tell you when things aren't going well, when there's been a mistake, or there's some type of error happening, you're not going to catch mistakes. They're going to get bigger inside your business. And if people are afraid to brainstorm, to throw out ideas because they think they're going to be shamed or that they'll be stupid, your business is not going to be able to innovate. So if the leader is the only one who can come up with ideas and you have untapped potential of their 500 employees, that business will never perform as well compared to one that actually, really helps foster innovation through collaborative success.
And you think that's common sense because I teach exactly that. I teach in leadership classes, and I talk about it all the time. So it's just common sense to know that if somebody comes up with an idea and you beat them up in front of everybody, now you've just wasted an asset that's never going to produce for you. And the smart people say, why would I put up with this bullshit? I'll move on to someplace else where I feel more respected. I can't imagine, why in 2026 anybody would even think that's a good idea.
You know, it's amazing how people rationalize these types of behavior. And it's wild to me that this is what's become in vogue. You know, it was about 2 years ago when I was at different gatherings in Silicon Valley, running group, coffees, meetups, and every single person I was talking to was going, "Oh my gosh, I have a boss from hell right now. Oh no, like I think they're going to do layoffs. Like, oh man, like I just got this project, our CEO is doing this crazy thing. He won't listen to any of us." And that's when I went, oh, wow, this is not a small trend. This is a pervasive, widening trend. And people don't have enough strategies to know how to actually preserve agency and autonomy around people like this. And that's why I wrote my book.
As AI increasingly accelerates, this is a question from the audience. As AI increasingly accelerates scientific discovery and decision making, what human leadership qualities become even more important in preventing organizations from becoming fear driven or overly reactive?
Yeah, so this is really important. And I've actually been doing AI research for many years. You know, I founded an AI startup, worked at an AI startup, did some AI work at Meta, and then did AI transformation at Insight Partners. And what I would say is that the more humans fear change rather than learning how to embrace change, the harder transitions are going to be. And I coach CEOs, but I also directly coach AI models. And the reason I coach people's LLMs and agentic systems for Frontier Labs is because the AIs need to be taught to make decisions in ways that are human, and the humans need to remember how to make decisions not from a place of fear, but from a place of abundance. When you have an abundance mindset, you make choices that are rational and future forward. When people have fear based mindsets, they cling very hard to the present. That often keeps them from evolving in ways that harm their future potential.
Another question from the audience. Venture-backed biotech companies operate in an environment where scientific uncertainty, regulatory hurdles, and investor expectations create constant pressure. What specific leadership practices help organizations sustain innovation and high performance without creating a fear-based culture?
Yeah, so I work with several different biotech founders. Biotech is a really interesting space in that you're essentially given funding, and then you don't know if it's going to result, and people jam in labs for years and years in hopes that something will happen. And so I think that what can help organizations with that is by defining what incremental progress looks like. So people can tell that there actually is movement taking place towards a lot of their goals, and by directly discussing with their employees the types of uncertainty and risk that they're dealing with. So if you frame things from the beginning as, hey, we're a really exciting moonshot, and this moonshot could totally change the world. We are going to work together to bust down the barriers, get through regulatory hurdles, and every month inch closer and closer, to being able to change the world. that kind of gives people something to anchor on because investor expectations aren't super relevant in biotech, and that there's a lot of work behind the scenes that can all of a sudden result or all of a sudden can't. And so it's the executive's job to keep those investors at bay.
You describe fear-based leaders as constantly conducting secret tests. What are they testing for, and how do employees unknowingly reveal their vulnerabilities?
Yes. So in the first 5 to 10 minutes that a fear based leader meets an employee, they're saying, how much can I manipulate this person? If I shove them, will they move? Are they going to be someone that actually contributes value? Or are they a mindless sheep and a lackey for me to extract value from and use? And so this is where it's really important to understand how you want to appear to a fear based leader. You can say, I'm going to be their ally. You can say, I want them to cast me as a mindless sheep so they leave me alone. You can say, I'm going to be their right hand and help them execute all of the things that they want done so that, the axe never falls on me. But if you don't know that they're testing you, well, that means that most people are sized up in a way that sticks forever, regardless of how accurate it is, and that can haunt their entire tenure at that company.
Um, what kind of leader is Mark Zuckerberg?
Mark Zuckerberg is someone who fell into leadership. He created something that had very sudden traction. The app did not have very positive roots. Rating women on a 10-point scale, being able to find each other across college campuses is not that great. And he very quickly, had people come in to help him professionalize his product. But he has never grown out of the idea that he is a wunderkind. And he tends to think that his ideas are the best ideas, and the people around him support that and make it happen. So I left Meta when he staked everything on the metaverse because I said, AR might be very big someday, but VR is not going to be a big thing. And he insisted it would be a big thing. And everyone around him, patted him on the head and said, yes, yes, that's right. And so it's hard to say whether he's a fear based leader himself or whether he is just completely surrounded by people who do not look out for his best interests, throwing tons of money at AI labs, trying to support innovation. But there are fear based leaders who are intentionally fear based, and then there are those who are fear based out of inattention or because, no one else really teaches them how to be different. And so right now, Meta has the probably the worst internal employee satisfaction scores in the valley because he has essentially said, I'm going to take all of my super talented engineers and make them teach AI how to do their jobs and create training data. And I'm also going to repeatedly lay off everyone who I don't think is good enough using AI to do that. And that's deeply inhumane and is essentially making him even less well liked than he was.
But you know how I wonder about this? I would say, God, that's poor leadership. It seems like that he's making a lot of errors, but yet he keeps getting richer. And it reminds me of Elon Musk when everybody laughed about he let off 80% of the workforce, and yet X is still working with that and telling people, like you said in the beginning of the show, you need to work 15 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week for me, and if not, I don't need you. And there were young people, of course, not married people with kids, who said, if I need to sleep there, I'll sleep there. How do these guys keep succeeding? And I interviewed somebody in this show who worked for Bill Gates and said that he ruled by fear and that you had to check. I was totally surprised about this because I thought, he was more robotic than anything. But they said every day, this guy said every day that he came in, you had to see what kind of mood he was in, and you never knew what mood he was in.
Yes. So I had friends who were at X when those cuts happened. Um, and I also have friends who worked at the Gates Foundation. And the reality is that most very senior leaders like that feel like they don't have to be nice. And when they don't have to be nice, they choose not to be. And their companies often get too big to fail. There are people who see early successes and they say, oh, wow, this person is really successful. I'll just fund her back everything they do forever. When you have downside risk insurance like that, it is actually very hard to totally crash out or totally fail. And once you have a high enough net worth, it's very hard to keep that net worth from growing. And so that's not necessarily an indicator of these guys' success. I think that where people get confused is that a lot of leaders who are quote unquote more mature or nicer or more thoughtful um, don't always take as big of swings because they don't have the insane level of self belief or conviction like Steve Jobs had. They're going to bet everything on this one thing because they happen to be so self absorbed to think they're a genius who can do it. And so part of what I work with CEOs on in my practice is helping them take big swings while not being terrible people.
I mean, I had lunch with Steve Jobs in 1990, and his people, when we walked out, he was speaking at a conference in Pittsburgh, and they sat me with him. And his people either walked far in front or far in back. And so when he got in the car, he asked his people, why does anybody walk with him? And they said, because he picks on us all the time. He's nasty. And I said, but you're still working for him. Well, he's brilliant. So even though these guys were born with the DNA they're born with, uh, and so they've always been kind of nasty and they've always been kind of critical and all these things. And yet, as much as when I'm teaching in school, and we want our leaders to be good people, when they see those examples becoming, you know, worth hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars, it's very hard to convince them that that's not the right way to go. Like, what leaders do you say uh, that are highly successful, like those guys in that stratosphere, that don't lead by fear?
Yeah, certainly. When you look at the business world, there are many people who don't lead by fear. However, they don't end up in the headlines as much because they're busy just doing their good things. You can look at Jensen Huang at NVIDIA. You can look at the Wojcicki sisters, at YouTube and 23andMe. You can look at people like Elad Gil at Color. You can look at Patrick Collison at Stripe. You can look at Nat Friedman, at GitHub. Satya Nadella, to some extent, can be like this. There are many, many, many more examples of the people who are good stewards and or geniuses who are not iconoclasts. But the fact is that iconoclasts make more interesting stories. So we hear about them more, partly because they seek the spotlight, and partly because people are fascinated by the ideas of, twisty geniuses. But these people are rarely geniuses. They just have access to huge amounts of capital that can help them do a lot of the things that they really care about.
But they got there. They started out with nothing, like all entrepreneurs do, and build it up. I'm agreeing with you. I run over 30 ventures. I always treated people respectfully. I never liked the idea of leading by fear and so forth, but I'm not a billionaire. And so my father used to say that, was the term they used to say about if you're so smart, why aren't you rich?
Well,
And
the reality is that good people don't want to be billionaires because billionaires represent extreme hoarding of wealth that could help the world beyond what any individual could ever need. And so if you look at, Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos's ex-wife,
yes,
she helped create Amazon from the ground up. And she immediately said, "This wealth should not be mine. It doesn't belong to me," and started distributing it across the world. Dustin Moskowitz, one of the founders of Facebook, has dedicated his whole life to giving the money back to the world. And so, if you say, "I want to be a billionaire," something is probably wrong with your self worth. And so, the people who go out, make a good living, do great things, but don't chase that single status symbol as a validation of their own personal worth are probably way healthier than the ones who have it.
Well, I'm glad I didn't become a billionaire then, so that makes me feel much better. Um, Two questions from the audience. Were you surprised by how personable Mark Zuckerberg comes off in public?
Mark Zuckerberg is not personable in public. Mark Zuckerberg is deeply robotic in public and often comes across highly evasive, particularly in his Senate hearings. In employee meetings, he can come across as thoughtful and empathetic. However, he has had many, many, many years of intensive coaching from people in PR who have tried to make him something other than what he is, which is someone who cares about building the things he wants without pretty much any thought to how it impacts the people around him.
How much impact or influence does Sheryl Sandberg have with him?
Well, Sheryl Sandberg is
Or is
no
she
longer.
not, or is she also a leader that leads by fear?
Um, so I have met Sheryl Sandberg before. I actually interviewed to be her chief of staff. I turned down that role um, because Cheryl is a consummate professional in many ways, but she is no longer at Meta, and that shows.
Mhm. You mean it shows in how the cult and what the culture's like now?
Yes, and the different strategic plays that the company is making. Um, she functioned to some extent as a grown up in the room, but just because she was a grown up and other people weren't, does not mean that she was an ideal grown up.
But she was a grown up, but
Yeah.
maybe not exactly what you were looking for. What were what were her strengths in your mind, and what were her shortcomings?
Um, I think that Cheryl is a very strong operator. And businesses, as they grow, need strong operators. And for the type of business she was in, she was a healthy counterweight. However, when I was at Meta, there was a training video at the beginning of orientation that talked about the issues with the Rohingya in Myanmar. That happened while Cheryl was there, and that should not have happened. You should never have products being used to commit different types of genocidal acts. So, to say that having one grown up in the room is helpful, I would say is also not enough.
Question from the audience: what do you think of Peter Thiel and his leadership style?
I'm very familiar with Peter Thiel. I have a lot of friends who are close to Peter Thiel. I am not so um, ignorant as to publicly bash Peter Thiel. However, I would say that Peter Thiel has a very singular mindset, and his singular mindset is reflected in the types of ventures that he backs. His singular mindset is well reflected in the way power is moving inside the country right now. And I think that that will benefit people who are like Peter Thiel while not benefiting people who are very different from him.
I don't I mean to get political here, but with President Trump, is he a leader who is driving people, or does he lead by fear, or is it a combination of things when you're watching him?
There are political leaders on both sides of the aisle who are fear based. Andrew Cuomo is fear based. I would argue that many figures in this administration are fear based. However, whenever you hear of someone who loves firing people, that signals a pretty extreme lack of empathy. And people like that often have trouble with retention. They often have trouble executing the things that they want because they tend to cultivate cultures beneath them where everyone is fighting each other to climb up, which means that they cannot effectively collaborate with each other.
Sounds like a mafia culture. I interviewed the real Donnie Brasco, and he said that everything is based on fear in that line of work, and so hence why um, some of these organizations don't really grow to their full potential and can't retain smart people as they once did when doors weren't open to Italians and all the other groups that the doors are now open to. One of your more provocative arguments is that some powerful leaders aren't really emotional adults, which is, I think maybe you might be alluding to that with Mark Zuckerberg. How do you recognize a leader's emotional age, and how should that change the way you communicate with them?
Yes, definitely. And to your last point, when I wrote this book, I was writing about individual fear based leaders. Since then, fear based leadership has progressed, where now there are so many fear based leaders in organizations that it's creating what is called organized abuse networks, and that is where organizations start encoding different types of abuse as forms of structural harm through their policies, and by, to your point, creating cultures that are like effectively business mafias. I have multiple plaintiff clients in my advising practice who are dealing with different types of networks of alumni from different companies who function in those ways. Now, on to emotional maturity in leaders. So many people don't understand that someone's physical age is not actually correlative to their emotional age. So if you have a leader that gets bored very easily, throws tantrums, like always needs lots of breaks, needs lots of hand holding, needs coddling, they might actually be like an emotional 2 or 3 year old. And if you have someone, who's very obsessed with the clicky nature at work, they might be an emotional teenager and they should be treated accordingly.
You argue that arrogance actually creates vulnerabilities because it produces enormous blind spots. How can someone safely use those blind spots when managing upward?
Yes. So arrogance creating blind spots is very beneficial to the people under someone. For example, if the person above you assumes everyone else around them is incompetent, they're the only one who knows how to do things well. Then, if you are asked essentially to go do something that you think is unethical, you can just completely mismanage it and do it badly so it doesn't happen. And the leader will go, well, of course you mismanaged it, you're incompetent. Right? And so using those blind spots can be really effective as a shielding mechanism.
What happens when fear-based leaders' version of reality and the facts are completely different? Is trying to prove the person wrong usually a mistake?
So, something else that doesn't get talked about enough is that not everyone is in the same reality as you. People walk around using different core beliefs as heuristics that guide their worlds. And that means that when they are going through the world, they're looking for confirmation of what they believe to be true rather than what is actually true. And so, if you repeatedly try to inject facts in someone who has a protective reality of denial around them, um, the facts will bounce off and they will likely end up attacking you.
You say these leaders can have remarkably long memories when they believe someone has crossed them. We know somebody like that. How do you know when you're moved from being an employee or a colleague to being perceived as an enemy?
Yes, so I call this the persona non grata. Um, it's where you're effectively moved from the kind of okay to complete enemy column. In business, this is often expressed through what I call the slow fade and push out. They start gradually taking away responsibilities. They maybe demote you and move you to a team that doesn't do as much important work. You start getting cut out of meetings, and so on and so on. And so people then gradually get pushed out of companies, fired, laid off with severance or not. Um, if this happens to you, there's almost no way to get back in someone's good graces. There are a few ways that you could try. But I always tell people if you're in a fear based organization and you can find something better, you should leave. You should straight up leave and find something better right now. You know, my book is for people who cannot find a workplace that is not fear based because that has become the norm. And so if you become persona non grata, you can try to get back in good graces, but chances are you're probably going to have to do something else.
Is it become fear-based because right now, not just our president, but other presidents around the world are using fear-based as the model for their leadership. And so when they saw our president do it successfully and get to the top job, do other people's just mimic it? Just like if they were super nice people and didn't operate that way, people would mimic that as well.
Yes, so the role models people see in society matter critically because what people see at the very top of the world is what gives them permission to behave in ways like those people. So when people see someone like our president or Andrew Cuomo or, um, like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos being bad boys, all of a sudden everyone else goes, well, they're successful, so maybe I should be like that to be like them.
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, and it creates what I would call like a gloves off culture, where before people had to pretend to care. They had to pretend to be nice, to be socially accepted. But now it's actually socially rewarded to not be nice. And that's why I wrote my book, because people who are used to cultures that are about values, rewarding effort, and fairness are completely hung out to dry right now.
Yeah, and that's very sad. What kind of leader was President Obama?
President Obama,
How do
you
you
know,
classify him?
you know, I would actually classify several presidents, both Republican and Democrat, in our history as strengths based leaders. Strengths based leaders say, I will do what only I can do, and then I will get out of the way and let all the talented people around me do what they can do. I will empower the people around me to reach their full potential because I believe in them, I trust them, and they matter. And I will hold people accountable. I will have really strong boundaries. Um, but at the end of the day, I trust that the people around me have positive intent. And that is a completely different orientation that yields completely different results. Um, and I think that it often shows in what different administrations accomplish. Um, there have been several presidents in history who have done really great jobs at being able to, cut down national debt, create social services, like all the different things that say, I see the people around them, and the people around me matter.
One of your first rules for managing upward is essentially don't give fear-based leaders information they can use against you. What information should employees stop volunteering?
All information that is not directly relevant to the tasks at hand. You should not say, "Oh, I'm so excited to go to my kid's little league game this weekend," because they'll call you in and make you work through it. You should not say, "I really, really care about this project. This project is the best thing I've ever done," because they may cut it just to spite you. Um, you should only say things like, here's the status of this project, here's how the status of this project is supporting your goals, and this is how I'm making you look good. Because your preferences, your thoughts are not welcome with them, and to them, they don't matter. They're seen as extraneous, except for the fact that they can then use them to influence or manipulate you.
You say being underestimated can actually become an advantage. How do you turn someone else's low expectations of you into strategic leverage?
I think that low expectations can be a gift, um, because if people don't think you're capable of much, they often give you much more freedom in organizations like this. If you are essentially a fly on the wall, you can learn tons and tons about how the organization operates, and then use it to your advantage to promote the types of projects you want in ways that matter, to protect yourself and your teams, etc. And I think that it's important for people to know that being seen as a cardboard cutout with no nuance can be positive, because if you know how you're seen and what they see your role as, you can effectively be anything that you want as long as you perform the basics of that role.
One of my favorite chapter titles is Sweet Them with Silence, Availability is Leverage. Why does being less available sometimes give you more power? I mean, sweat them. Sorry.
Yes, so sweating people with silence is important because to leaders like this, constant availability and attention is very much about a validation of their importance. And so having you be constantly available, constantly attentive, constantly replying to them is something that shores up their own ego, because they need someone externally to shore up their ego. And if you're not available, it makes them spiral. They think, do they not care about me? Am I not important enough? Do they actually not, want to be helping me? And you can just say, oh, sorry, I was on a flight. Oh, sorry, I was at a doctor appointment. But by setting those boundaries and not being as particularly available, it can genuinely impact how much leverage you have.
It's funny, I've heard that before, that even though you're trying to show somebody how hard you're willing to work, it could backfire against you.
The reality
I,
is that if you act like a doormat, people will never respect you. And being constantly available and having no life is a little bit like that, right? Um, it essentially says you're willing to be someone else's security blanket. And who would rather be a security blanket than a person, you know?
um, couple questions here. Uh, one is, what does the succession plan look like in a fear-based organization?
Fear based organizations don't like planning for succession because it means that there's a chance that the leader could leave and or die. These leaders are deeply afraid of mortality. They are really afraid of getting old. That's why they're constantly investing in longevity startups, because they want to rule the world forever. They do not like to groom successors, and if they do, they'll typically groom five of them and keep them infighting each other to prove their worth forever until they have to be replaced. In my experience, they tend to leave messes behind them unless their board forces them to do otherwise, and they have a very high key man risks. You know, if Elon Musk died tomorrow, what would happen to all of his companies, right? How would their valuations change? And so it genuinely creates problems.
How would you describe Gavin Newsom's leadership style? Is it effective?
I'm less familiar with Gavin Newsom than some other figures. Politicians are quite tough.
Oh,
Oops,
you muted yourself. There
sorry.
you go.
The private leadership style that they show amongst their staff, amongst their teams, is often very, very different than their public face. So I don't know what Gavin Newsom's actual face is like inside his organizations. I would say that he tries to be effective. On the national stage, he tries to posit something different. Um, but most people who have climbed to governor level roles are not the most authentic people, with a few exceptions. Tim Walz, for example, is very authentic. Um, but politicians in general tend to have multiple faces.
Last question. This is from the audience. In my experience, many women who aspire to become managers, leaders, tend to copy men who lead by fear, and they could become worse. Do you have different advice to handle female fear-based leaders compared to men? It's a good one.
Yes.
What?
Yeah, so fear-based leaders in women express differently than in men. Think cutting comments, being shut out of meetings, being privately eviscerated rather than publicly eviscerated in meetings. What I find is that in fear-based cultures, the entire culture is often so hostile to women and other types of minorities that those women and minorities then have to fight each other for the very few seats at the top, if there are any. And that often means that the women beat each other down to keep other people from climbing up. And so I don't know if I would call that genuine fear-based leadership. It's almost more like a fight to survive.
It's very, very unfortunate. And it's sad. Everything you're telling us sounds very sad that leadership is going in a very negative direction.
Yes,
Um,
I'm actually working on a second book that addresses that, where I talk about how to be a strengths based leader and then outline the predator playbook, which is all the different ways that people systematically harm each other in business and how you defend against it, because these norms are becoming more and more common.
I think the only way you're going to show that is numerically. That if you can show them that there's a real return on being a good person, they're not going to do it. If the role models are becoming trillionaires by leading through fear, people are going to say, I guess that's the right way to lead people, and that way you don't become soft and a doormat. You know, if you're at where they always say, nice guys finish last. So I think that's going to be very hard to accomplish to get people unless somebody's really successful and even employees say, oh my God, that was the greatest man or woman to work for because they cared about me and uh, promoted my maximizing my potential. And if you don't have leaders that are doing that, people will just follow whatever the leadership style is, just like sports, where everybody kind of follows whatever the winner does, right? Then they just uh, mimic that person. And Michael Jordan was a nasty leader, and Kobe Bryant followed him, and between the two of them, they won 11 championships. So
Yeah,
it
there's a
sounds like it's going to be hard to do.
there's a fantastic book series called Nice Dragons Finish Last, and it's about how people who are consistently values driven end up sweeping the board at the end of the day. And I think that there may not be enough publicized examples of this because those types of leaders don't seek the spotlight in the same way. But it does not mean that they are not there. And it doesn't mean that they aren't ultimately more successful as people. And just like bell bottom jeans go in and out of style, so do leadership styles. And just because we're swinging in this direction right now doesn't mean that in 10 years from now we won't swing back.
And more than likely will. Like you said, all it takes is a couple people to be successful who are major public figures, and everybody follows that style or they look for that style. I thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I look forward to your next book. And we could have probably sat here for hours just asking you what you thought about different types of leaders, and we appreciate you being so candid.
Yeah, of course. It's my pleasure to be here. And for anyone who has questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much again. Have a great rest of your weekend. Bye, everybody. And there will be no program next week. I am taking some vacation time. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.
You too, Mark.